morning, everyone. Welcome to the early session. It's 9 o'clock on a Friday, and I hope y'all are happy to be here. This morning we have for you Chris Boykin, the Director of Channel SEs for Cycognito, presenting One Source to Rule Them All, Accelerating Cyber Risk Management, or Reduce Attack Surface Risk with Cycognito.
All right, thanks. Hey, well, thank you guys for waking up early, not being too hungover or anything from last night's partying. I assume that might be either that or the fact that it's Friday the 13th could be why we're low attending this morning. But my name is Chris Boykin, and I'm with Cycognito. We're going to talk to you about one source to rule them all. So feel free to ask questions as we go along. We'll do Q&A at the end if we need to. But first things first, what we do is external attack surface management. So if you're not familiar with the term EASM or external attack surface management, just want to define that real quick. Basically, it has to do with mapping out your attack surface, number one, from the outside. So if we're looking from the outside in, like an attacker would, basically attacker's point of view, what does your organization look like? How do we map that out? What assets are out there that are exposed to the internet? And then the second piece to it, to manage that risk, is to assess it. So you would have to do testing and those kind of things to assess that external attack surface so you know what to do. There's a definition at the bottom, but I'm not going to read that for you. Everybody can read. But basically, these are the two major components of external attack surface management. So let's talk a little bit about the terms, right? So what is considered external attack surface? It's any entities that are out there that are either owned or attributed to you. Right, so anything that is owned or attributed to you, that could be, we'll talk about what those assets, what we consider an asset are, but it's those exposed assets that we can draw back to your company or a subsidiary or something like that of your company. So what's an entity? It's just that. It's your parent company, the holding company, and any subsidiaries, third parties, supply chains, affiliates, joint ventures, any of those things that you actually have a pointer to out on the internet. Those things that are exposed like that, this is part of your attack surface. And what are the types of assets that we're talking about? Not just IPs. A lot of times people think of just an IP address that's exposed, that's an asset. Well, it is an asset, but we also want to look deeper at things like web applications, domains, certificates, things like that. All of those things are exposed to the internet, and they all could potentially have a risk associated with them. So we'll take a look at those APIs as well. And then what is it that creates this risk, right? So it's dynamic IPs, things that are out there that are in the cloud, maybe part of a cloud dynamic network, right? Something where they're changing constantly. We're spinning things up and down. Maybe it's part of a CDN where you've got different locations you're coming from, and therefore you have a different IP depending on what location you're at, where your source is. You could be served up from a different IP. We have to make sure that we understand, monitor, test all of those areas, right? Also things like, another reason that there's risk out there in the external is because people with shadow IT, right? You got developers that are spinning up test boxes and such. And so those guys have to be monitored as well. Sometimes we don't even know about them because people can use their credit card literally and just spin up cloud instances and put something out there. They move on to production. They forget that they need to go spin that down. So there's risk in those items that are out there as well. Whenever you're talking mergers and acquisitions, right? A lot of times it happens quickly. It's happening at the executive level. The security and IT teams are the last to be told about it. And then all of a sudden it's a rush. It's a fire drill to figure out how are we going to connect these networks? What do we need to secure? What does their security posture look like as opposed to ours? And so understanding what that looks like, doing a pre-assessment a lot of times is not done. And obviously, with all of the cloud that's happening today, people use more than one cloud, right? So you can't just say, okay, well, I'm going to look at my Google Cloud instance. You have to look at AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, Oracle, all of the different cloud environments that might be used by a company. Sometimes they forget to continue to monitor those and secure those. And then obviously, web applications that are out there that just aren't properly secure. So when we talk external attack surface management, one of the main things that we want to understand is how do we define it? What does it look like, right? So these are the 5 main components when it comes to managing external risk. First one, understanding the organization and doing that reconnaissance on that. What does my organization look like from the top down? The main entity, right? The main corporation, and how many subsidiaries do they own? What other companies are related to them? And then of those companies, are there other companies owned by them? So this can go multiple levels deep in different companies depending on how big they are. And a lot of times those entities don't know about each other, right? If you're a large company like a large manufacturing company of automobiles or something like that, you have locations all over the world that are different company names, but they're ultimately still owned by the main company. This can be an issue. So you have to understand what that looks like more than just, hey, this is an asset that we own. Second thing is actually the assets, right? Discovering and knowing about all of those assets and giving them context, knowing what they're doing, who owns them, where they're located, what's running on them. All of those things become important as part of managing that external risk. The third thing would be doing security testing. This is that risk assessment, and not just port scanning or things like that, but doing active security testing in order to truly know that a risk exists and it's not just, a number and a false positive that's out there that you're chasing your tail around. You have to know what truly is exploitable. So that becomes a big deal, is knowing how to test. The fourth thing would be risk prioritization, because once you have all these risks and you know where your vulnerabilities are and you know where you can be exploited, you have to actually be able to prioritize that to know what to go fix first. So again, that's a component of managing that external risk. And then lastly, being able to speed up that remediation. So let's talk about that. What are CISOs trying to solve today? This is one of the biggest challenges that they face, because they know that the external risk, over 80% of the breaches that happen today happen from the outside coming in. So we have to understand what this looks like. One of the biggest challenges today is visibility. Understanding what it is that I have that's sitting out there on the internet that's actually exposed. Because if I don't know about it, I certainly cannot secure it. So knowing about those unknown unknowns. So this is a big deal. And if you look, this is a quote from a CISO in a Fortune 500 company. Said they've been breached a few times in the last few years. Every time it's been on a device they didn't even know they needed to be securing. So that's a big ordeal. The next thing that the CISOs are trying to fix is testing coverage, right? Most people, if they have hundreds or maybe thousands of applications that are out there exposed to the internet, they don't have the money or the manpower to actually test 100% of them. So they test what they feel like is the most important, or what they would consider their crown jewels, right? And then that is all that they test. When we talk to CISOs of large companies, it's typically less than 10% of their assets that they actually have the time and money to test. And they only test them in a annual basis most of the time. So they only have partial coverage, right, of what they're looking at, what they're testing. The third piece is prioritization. Understanding now if I am doing a good job of trying to find out what my vulnerabilities are that exist out there, how do I prioritize that when there are thousands of issues that come at me saying that they're all critical, right? And what I like to talk about when I talk to these is, if everything is critical, then nothing is critical. Imagine having a prioritization list of your own, right? A to-do list for today, and you have 25 items on it, which is overwhelming for one day. And all of those things are priority one. Everything is important. Well, if it's all important, then where do you start? Right? You just start throwing darts at the board and say, well, I'm going to do the easiest one first. I'm going to do whatever. I mean, that's not prioritization. So you have to understand how to prioritize. And CISOs are challenged with this every day. They have too many critical issues, no way to understand what is really critical and what needs to be worked on. So this is a graph of kind of what we call maturity, right? And there's 4 pieces to the maturity of managing this external risk. So first thing is visibility, like we talked about, right? And as we said, most companies today, they have maybe 50 to 75% visibility into what's exposed to the internet. And this is through us interviewing CISOs, right? What do you feel like you actually know? And then we run a test and we see what they know. They typically know between half and 75% of what they actually have exposed, which is scary enough in itself. The next piece is the actual coverage of that testing, as I spoke about a second ago. When you're testing hundreds or thousands of different assets, how many of those can you afford to or have time to test? And we're told about 10%. At the most, maybe 25%. And then the next question we always ask is, how often do you test them? Number one answer, annually. We all know that annual pen tests and things like that only give you a snapshot in time. If the only time you look at something is once a year, then you're doing yourself a disservice. Right? So just imagine, let me take it to real life. Just imagine if you only double checked that your alarm was set and your door was locked once a year. Right? So you assume it's working fine, but the day you leave it unlocked is the day that the bad guy comes in. Right? The day you leave your alarm off is the day that you get attacked. Right? So this is important, is that you do it more frequently. The most often that we hear is annual. If they're really aggressive, maybe quarterly they're doing these tests. And remember, they're only doing it on maybe 10% of their assets. So what kind of security coverage is that? So then that last piece down there, if you can't read it, it says MTTR, mean time to remediation, right? From the time I find out about a critical asset to the time that I actually resolve that issue is typically, based on what we hear, a few months. Right? So a few months from the time I know about it, and who knows, by the time I know about it, if I'm only looking annually, it could be a year before that it was actually a problem. So all of these issues, what we're trying to do is get everyone into the green, right? That they understand 100% of what is exposed, that they are testing 100% of their assets, that they're doing it on a very frequent basis, right? And therefore, they reduce that MTTR. So we're going to talk about what people are doing today to try to resolve this. And this slide that I'm about to build out here has to do with what we found out when talking to prospects and talking to customers out there. And we asked them, how do you manage external risk today? After we talk about that maturity slide, right, we say, okay, does this sound right for you? Right? And then we say, how do you do this? And so the way that we're told, right, that most companies do this today, first things first, they have to know what their assets are, right? So there's different methods that they keep a track of this. The most popular, unfortunately, what we find and what we hear is still spreadsheets. Spreadsheets. Last I checked, it was 2023. And we're using spreadsheets to track which IPs I have out there, what domains I'm using, those kind of things. Everybody knows that a spreadsheet gets outdated really quickly, right? The ones that actually put some effort into this, they may use tools that are out there, things like Shodan, BitSight, Expanse, Risk IQ, things like that, to help do some discovery and see what maybe other people say is exposed out there on the internet. Regardless of how they do it, this is step number one. Get that visibility. Once they understand the visibility, they got to move to the next piece, which is, let me give context to now what I found. Right? So I found that I have an asset. It exists on this IP address. What do I know about that asset? What's the context? So now I have to do my open source intelligence, right? I have to find out, okay, where is it? What is it? What's running on it? Who owns it? What part of my company does it belong to? All of this information has to be gathered up in some way. I talked to a large energy company here in Houston earlier this year, and I asked them, is this, I was going through this slide, and I said, how are you guys doing here? And they said, well, we feel like we did a pretty good job on the discovery side, right? We used this tool and that tool, and we did all this stuff. And I said, okay, what about the contextualization, right? The attribution. They said, yeah, we did that too. It took us 14 months to do it. 14 months and 5 people to go gather context on all of the assets that they had. And so this is a long process if you're even doing it, right? Then you curate that, you put it into your CMDB, and that's where you track it from that point on. How are you keeping up with this data, right? So the next thing, once they understand the assets that they have and they do whatever contextualization they can do, right? Then they move to the third step, which is now I have to assess my risk. How do I do that? Tools, people, skills, right? Hiring outside firms, whatever it is that you do to test, right? And this is where a lot of tools are going to come into play. Depending on how deep you're going, if you're just using a vulnerability management tool like maybe a Qualys, Rapid7, Tenable, Nessus, things like that, or you're going deeper, maybe using DAST tools like Burp Suite or something, right? You can get a lot deeper. If you get external pen tests, you can do that as well. But those all cost money and take a lot of time. This is why people only do 10% of the work, right? They only do 10% of their assets. They can't afford it. It takes too long. The fourth phase is now that I have done that, I've got to the point of knowing what I have, knowing what's risky, excuse me, knowing what's risky out there, knowing where they exist. Now I have to figure out how do I prioritize, right? Back to that, everything's critical. Right? It's all critical. None of it's critical. If everything out there that I'm looking at is priority one, I don't know where to start. I have to understand, where do I start? How do I start? Where do I go? So that's where prioritization comes in, right? So maybe I use a SIM to help narrow some of that down. I have some kind of process that I go through. Maybe I use another tool, maybe like a Boykin or Kina or something like that to try to prioritize things. Maybe I feed into an Exonius or something like that to give me some kind of consolidation. And then I start making decisions on, okay, I think this is the most important. Let me go work on this, right? And then the last piece, now I have to go do remediation. So I get to remediation and I throw it over the fence to my guys who have to do remediation, right? And I say, okay, I've got a blue keep issue on this server. I need you to go fix it. And what does my remediation guy do? Huh? Right? Because my remediator of this is probably a server admin that's never heard of Blue Keep and doesn't know what the heck I'm talking about. So now they have to say, okay, because they're not security people necessarily. So they say, okay, I'm going to go Google it. I'm going to figure out what Blue Keep is. I'm going to figure out why it's important and how do I fix it and who do I need to get in touch with and the approval process and the change requests and all of these things that need to happen to remediate it. And then a few months down the road, I finally get it done. Right? So all of this stuff right here takes time, costs money, but this is how people are doing it today. All of these little red circles that I just put up on the screen, these are human intervention, right? So far you've seen you probably have 4, 5, 18 tools, right? Multiple teams probably doing this work. And then you have all this human intervention. What does that do? Human intervention always enters in two things. Number one, time and effort, right? And number two, the room for mistakes. If I've got to export and import something, I might miss something. If I have to make a change or put in some data entry, I might miss something, right? So all of this, that's a lot of places that something else can be entered in as a bigger risk. This has a lot of negative consequences, right? Takes a long time, costs a lot of money, and there's hundreds of hours of spent to do this. And then, even if I do remediate it, now I have to revalidate, make sure it's actually gone, that issue. This is how people are doing this today, managing the external risk. And as you can see, costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time. So let's talk about Psycognito and how we approach this subject, right? So the very first thing, we're going to go walk right through those steps. So number one, first thing we got to do is we got to discover. We got to understand what you have that you don't already know about so that you can start controlling the narrative, right? So that you can actually secure these things. We do that through a massive botnet that we created. Tens of thousands of nodes across the world that actually go and do discovery work for us. Right? So we're using natural language processing, basically the ability to read electronic documents, right? Natural language processing, and using this massive botnet, we're able to go and discover what a company looks like from the outside looking in a hacker's perspective, right? Without any seed data whatsoever. So all we know is, here's my target company. Go find everything you can about it, right? Now, I could use humans, a ton of humans to do this, but we don't. Like I said, we built this botnet. It goes and does it. It looks at resources like Google, Wikipedia, Crunchbase, your public filings if you're a public company, like your 10Ks, Standards & Poor, like all of these public resources to find out, what does your organization even look like from the outside? And we build a map of your organization. From the top to bottom, I know it's kind of hard to see, but from top to bottom, you'll see, here's my parent company. Here's the 12 subsidiaries they own. Of those subsidiaries, some of those subsidiaries own more, right? And then we build the entire thing out. It looks like an organizational chart, and we provide the proof for you of how we got there. So what our botnet did was go out and read all of these websites and all of this information, gathered it up, used machine learning to make hypotheses, put it together, and now you see we have a visual representation and proof of how it is, how we found this information. Next, and this is before we ever look for an asset, we understand what does your organization look like, because that's going to become really important when we get to attribution. Next thing we do is we start looking for assets, right? So to find an asset, same botnet, looking at public data, things like ARIN, DNS, Whois, other scanners that are out there, finding what are each of these entities that we just mentioned, what do they own? Which IP ranges do they own? What domains do they own? Subdomains? What applications do they run? Who are their connected relationships? All of these things. And we start building that out. So for every single asset, of which we find 5 different types of assets, ranges, IPs, domains, certificates, web applications, of any of those, we're going to provide detailed information like who owns it, who's responsible for it. So when it breaks or it needs to be patched, who do I pick up the phone and call, or who do I open a ticket to? Things like what environments are running on it, DNS servers, mail servers, web servers, different types of application servers, right? Which types of protocols are being used, platforms, right? So not just, hey, port 21 was open, I found that with a scanner, so you must be running FTP, there's vulnerabilities in FTP, you need to go look at them. That's generic, that's easy, right? No, we're looking and saying, no, not only is port 21 open, you are running FTP, and you're running pure FTPD as the application on that. Now I can target my testing, which is going to be the next thing we do, to say, hey, pure FTPD we know has vulnerabilities, let's test for it and see if they have them. Then we're also looking at things like location. So we're providing context, very deep context, reconnaissance context. Our company was founded by the CTO of the 8200 unit of the IDF, right? So the Israeli Defense Forces, right? A lot of people learning about that today in the news, unfortunately. But the 8200 unit is their cyber unit. Our founder used to be the CTO for 10 years. He's now running this, and they developed this type of technology. Their whole job, their whole world was doing reconnaissance on the enemies, the guys that want to do bad things to Israel. That was their job. So they had to do it quietly, and they had to do it accurately, and they had to do major recon. And so this is why and how we do all of these things. So the next step, now that I know about all my assets, not 50% of them, now that I know about all my assets, now I need to test. So how are we going to test? Not just port scanning, not just banner grabbing, right? We're going to do active testing, meaning I'm actually going to communicate with the device and try to authenticate, try to do different things like you see on the screen here. Dynamic application security testing, cross-site scripting, SQL injection, credential stuffing, OAuth top 10, all of the types of things that you would do at the beginning of your work if maybe you were a pen tester, right? Trying to see what is actually exploitable with real evidence, not just, this might be a vulnerability. All right, so we're going to provide that within our system as well. Here's the evidence of the things that are going on in your machine. So we're, like in this case here, we send a curl command. We get a response back. We know that if we get a certain response back, after sending these certain commands in, that we have a vulnerability there, with accuracy and confidence that you could go and actually exploit this vulnerability. So now we're eliminating all those false positives that everybody has just because, oh, you're running Citrix 8.7.4.2, it's known to have a CVE vulnerability, so this is there, right? Not validating that there's mitigating control in place of it, something blocking it, a WAF or a IPS or something that's going to keep you from getting in. That's a passive type of test, right? This is an active test that would say, we guarantee you can get in, right? We guarantee this is a hole. You need to go patch this now. Then we have to now, so because we've found more, think about it, because we've discovered more assets, we've tested all of those assets, so we've now tested more assets, we are going to have more vulnerabilities, right? And we're going to have more critical vulnerabilities because of the way we test. So now prioritization becomes even more important whenever you get to this stage. So now I have those thousands of critical issues. What do I do about them? Now this is where we enter in the exploit intelligence, right? So we have threat intel feeds to look at the dark web to say, okay, there's exploit tools available. There's validation tools available. There's chatter about this on the dark web saying that people are exploiting this vulnerability. We can prioritize that higher versus something that just like CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, from any other testing platform is going to say, oh, this is critical. It's always going to be critical, right? Cross-site scripting, critical issue, always going to be critical. But when you have more intelligence about it and you've done active testing on it, you can see, is it really critical for this organization? Maybe we see there's a mitigating control. Maybe we see that, there's something else that's been put into place. Or we realize that this is not even talked about and never has been exploited. We can downgrade it and say, yeah, CVSS may say it's critical, but it truly isn't critical for you. So we can downgrade that score, reprioritize it so you spend your time wisely. Same with things that, maybe CVSS will say is a medium score. We may look at it and with threat intel be able to say, well, because we know there's exploit tools, you can download, point and click, hack somebody, and we hear people talking about it a lot, we can raise the awareness of this and say, no, this is really where you need to focus your time. Whereas in any other situation, you're probably going to ignore a medium when you have 4,000 criticals. Then we're going to give everything a grade, right? Just like most people do, we say, hey, here's a grade. You're an F, you're a D, you're a whatever. How do I remediate, right? So when I throw it to that remediation team, how do I do this? This is where more prioritization comes in the tool that says, okay, you're an F, you want to get to a D, how do you get there? Okay, so in this case here, to get from an F to a D, there were 680 things that needed to be remediated and 98 assets that had those issues on them. Still sounds like a lot, doesn't it? Unless you knew that this was about 140,000 issues that were found. So we've just taken 140,000 issues and narrowed it down to 98 that are going to get you the most bang for your buck to say this is where your true risk exists. We're also tracking things like the major advisories that are out there in the internet now, like MoveIt and Log4j and all of these kind of things that are considered advisories, all the sys advisories, etc. And because we know so much about your organization, we can tell you right out of the gate whether or not the assets that you have are qualified as part of this advisory, right? So you'll see here potentially affected assets out of almost 16,000 assets. There was 202 that could be affected by one of these advisories. Okay, well that's good, but then I still have to go look at 202 assets to see if they truly are exploitable. Well, because we're doing that active testing, we can provide that to you by saying, look, out of those 202, 52 of those are actually exploitable. So spend your time on those, go fix those, because your other 150, they're already safe. Right? So this becomes a real advantage whenever you're trying to make sure that you're focusing your time in the right place for remediation. And that's where we get that accelerated remediation. Add into that The fact that we integrate with over 500 different other solutions out of the box, right? Ticketing systems, SIMs, SOARs, XDRs, all of these. We can now communicate back and forth, enhance their information. We can also put together automated responses to things. Like in this case, right? Bluekeep was found on a few different devices. Automatically kick off a ticket within ServiceNow. Those tickets get worked by the engineers that are going to fix those things, goes through some kind of SOAR maybe or whatever it is that they need to do to fix it, and then kicks back a signal to us to say, hey, somebody wants to close this case. We need to revalidate and see if the issues are gone. We'll automatically run a revalidation. They're gone. All right, now we can actually close the ticket. So we're closing the loop in this entire solution. So just as a quick review, because I talked about a lot, right? Number one, yes, we do a lot of stuff, right? Which is why we say it's one source to rule them all, right? Because we can become that single source of truth for that external attack surface because of everything that we're discovering. Just as a reminder, right? We start by building out what does the business look like? Who's the main company? Who do they own? What are their subsidiaries? What are all of these organizations? And what are the acquisitions they took? An example at the bottom here, there's a Fortune 500 company that became one of our clients. When we did this during our proof of value to them, we found 800 subsidiary companies. Imagine being at a company where there's 800 sub-companies as part of that. Some of those 4, 5, 6 levels deep. And you're the CISO at the top level. How do you manage that? How do you make sure everything's secure? So then we go and we give context and find those assets like we talked about. They had 1 million assets. That's a lot of assets. It's hard to cover all of that, right? So the next thing we do is test. Now we have to go find out where the risks are. And if you remember from earlier, I said we're going to test 100% of the assets that we find. So yes, we tested 1 million assets for this customer. No one else out there is going to test every single asset. People today just don't have the time or the bandwidth. If you don't automate the process, it's not going to happen. We test 1 million assets. We find 200,000 issues. 200,000 issues. Hand that to your SOC and say, go fix these. Right? I don't care how big your SOC is, 200,000 issues is going to overwhelm them. Right? So, and that's at the high-level testing, right? So then we took that and we prioritized those 200,000, narrowed it down to 50 major issues that they had that needed to be resolved that would eliminate 95% of their risk. That's prioritization. That's focus. 50, I can handle that. Me and one other guy could probably handle that, right? So true prioritization will give that to you. And then lastly, helping that remediation, bringing that MTTR from months down to days, right? Because now I have context. I understand what's truly important. I don't have to throw darts at a prioritization list, right? All I have to do is say, okay, this is 100% sure this issue exists on this asset. I need to fix it now. I can fix it much quicker that way. Here's a real-life example. Fortune 10 oil and gas company. I'm not going to say they're in Houston, but they could be. They had some big challenges, right? They had big challenges. They were breached several times, every time from unknown assets. So they had visibility issues, obviously. Right? They had testing coverage issues because they had a lot of assets that they had no idea that were out there. They didn't even know to test those. And even of the ones they did know, they weren't testing often enough or enough of them. So what did we do? We came in with that major visibility. Sorry, we came with that major visibility. We tested all of their assets. We found all the vulnerabilities, told them exactly where to go fix them, and the CISO told us, you helped us shift from the unknown unknowns to the known knowns, which is very important. We were able to go in and we replaced the previous solution that they were using, and we found 37 critical attack vectors that were all tied to a joint venture of a company in Russia. They didn't even know about this joint venture of the company in Russia, and they had 37 major vulnerabilities that they found there. We found 1.5 million exposed assets at this organization and eliminated 20 hours of manual work per month. Huge cost savings. ROI on this was literally within months for them to adapt our solution. So that's Psycognito. That's what we do. What kind of questions can I answer from you guys? Yes, ma'am. Where do we factor in the priority of the asset itself? Absolutely. 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 Sure. So based on the multiple types of things, right? So if it's just an asset versus an asset, right? So this asset has a vulnerability, this asset has the same vulnerability. What's the difference here, right? So we're looking at multiple different things for prioritization. One of them being discoverability. How easy was it for us to find that asset and attribute it to this organization, right? So if one is easy to find and one's really hard to find, it's going to be that way for an attacker as well. So that can help in prioritization. Another one is the attractiveness, right? So how attractive would that asset be to a adversary, right? Based on other things we know about it, right? So if it's got a mail server on it, and it's got a database on it, and it's running a web app, and it's also running DNS. Like if it's doing too many things, right, and it has vulnerabilities that are severe vulnerabilities, that's going to bump it up in the prioritization, right? And then, of course, that threat intel is going to help us in just understanding what's important or not. So. Sure. So if you wanted to put so from us, we're coming from the outside in, external point of view. We don't know about your internal, this is my crown jewels, right? We're trying to say, here's your open door, go close that door, right? So really, I mean, that's where maybe with our integration partners, you could say, okay, here's my crown jewels. Here's the context I got from Psycognito. Here's the context I have from my CMDB or whatever. I know that this is flagged as crown jewel. Now I need to bump priority up for this one. Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, keep in mind, we're doing everything unauthenticated. We have no seed data. We're literally coming at you just like an attacker. So we don't know. We're just trying to find a back door. Right? That's it. It's like, hey, I mean, if I'm stealing cars, right? If I go into this garage over here, I'm going to steal cars. If I go for the Mercedes or the Porsche or whatever, right, it's probably the most secure, right? If I go for the, whatever, the Yugo, I don't even know if they make those still, right? Then it's less secure, right? Probably doesn't have an alarm system. It's probably easier. But what am I going to do as an attacker, right? I'm going to walk by and I'm going to pull on a door handle and see if the door opens, right? Because people forget to lock their doors. Even on Mercedes, right? They forget to lock the door. If I happen to pull it and the door opens, the alarm doesn't go off, I'm in, right? So I'm looking for that least path of resistance. That's how I'm going to get in. So I don't care if it's your crown jewels. Once I'm in, I know it's a lot softer and gushy in there. I can easily navigate around, and move laterally and stuff. So I just want my first step into the door, right? And that's what we're trying to find. Hey, here's where you're most likely to get attacked because you have a wide open hole. And here you are. Right, so we're finding, with our credential server, right, we're finding people leaving default credentials and easy guess passwords and all this stuff on big, major applications and things. And we're like, that's where I'm getting in, right? Great question. Anybody else? What other questions you have? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. A GRC tool or something. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, if you didn't hear it, he does compliance auditing and stuff like that, right? And how can they use our data for something like that, right? Maybe it's not that he's going to go do a pen test on it. He just needs to report this information, right? So built into our platform, we have a lot of different, because we have so much data, and so much curated, real data about true risk, right? We can slice and dice that however you want, right? So we build dashboards within our system that actually we have a compliance dashboard, for instance. We track 6 different compliances out of the box, right? NIST, a couple of the NIST, the ISO, PCI, things like that. And we can tell you exactly which assets, externally facing, remember, externally facing assets actually fall outside of your compliance and help you focus there. So you can easily just run compliance reports straight from our thing and help that. As well, through the integrations, if you have tools, right, we're open API, number one, so if we don't already have a connector, which we have hundreds, 500, 600 different connectors out of the box, if we don't already have a connector, then we can build one really easily and get that data exported over, right, into your reports. So that's another way to do it as well. Yeah, great question. I don't know that I really mentioned it, right? We touched on a lot of things, but cadence is huge, right? Remember how often you're doing these tests, right? And so I'm just thinking through all the words I said. I don't remember mentioning that, but we do this at minimum, on a monthly basis. At minimum, right? So we're already 12 times more often than your typical company is doing their pen testing, right? But we can do it as often as weekly. Right, so, and when we talk about that cadence, we're talking full discovery and full testing. So literally on a weekly basis for that example company I put up here, we're doing discovery on 1 million assets and testing on 1 million assets. We're looking for things that are new acquisitions that popped up, new assets that are coming up and down, right? In the cloud, we talked about earlier, in the cloud, things are spun up and down all the time, right? New shadow IT devices that are spun up, right? We're going to find that because we're doing it regularly. And we actually had a customer, they actually on our website as a video, whatever you call it, testimonial. Thank you. All right. Thank you, self. Video testimonial, right, where he talks about the CISO of Colgate-Palmolive, talks about the fact that he found out about a new acquisition they made from our tool. Right? Like the CISO didn't even know that an acquisition was made by their company in some area of their company. So he didn't even know he needed to assess or secure that organization. And of course, it pops up in the console. He's like, what is this? Goes and talks to in the next board meeting and like, oh yeah, we bought that company last month. Oh, okay, thanks for the notice, right? So now he has to go secure it. Of course, there was all kinds of issues out there. So, discovering on a regular basis is also a big deal. Any other questions? I know some of you guys came in late. I'm not going to redo the whole thing, but it is going to be available on video if you want to see it after. I don't know when they're posting these, but I know they're recording all the sessions. So if you miss some of it or miss certain sessions, you can go back and watch them as well. But quick summary: we find a lot of stuff, we test all of it, we prioritize it so that you know what to go fix. That's kind of our story. So, and we do it all automated. So even our competition that is out there, right? So we have competitors. Our competitors sit in each of the little areas, most of them, right? So, but we don't have a competitor that's doing the whole gamut of what we do, right? We have competitors in discovery. I mean, even open source ones like Shodan and stuff. That's a competitor technically, right? And then of course, the BitSights and Risk IQs of the world, Security Scorecard and other SRSs that are out there, right? But then they don't compete with us really when it comes to testing because they don't do the types of testing we do. Testing, right? We have tons of competitors in testing, right? Because we use some of their technology in the back end as well. But they're also competitors if you just happen to have their tools, right? So all of your testing tools, Qualys, Rapid7, Tenable, all these guys, Burp Suite, all of these things, those are competitors of ours, right? But that's their focus, right? That's what they do. They test. You got to feed that machine. You got to know what you need to test and tell it to test it, or it's not going to get tested, right? And every time you add more IPs or whatever to test in those things, it costs you more money, right? And prioritization, obviously other competitors and stuff there too, but like nobody's kind of put the whole thing together, and absolutely nobody's automated the process. And that's the big difference. Yes, sir. Colleague. Where is our booth? That's a good question. We're booth 116, but that means nothing to anyone. So if you go to that massive room that's in there where they do the keynote speeches, it says track 1, but it's like where you sat down to eat or where you saw the keynote yesterday. We're in that room when you first walk in. If you're facing the stage, we're on your right-hand side. We have a little table. You'll find me there. You'll find my colleague there. Happy birthday, Eunice. Friday the 13th birthday. And we can tell you more about it, show you a demo, set up a demo for later, whatever you want to do, find out more about what we do. Any other questions? Awesome. Thanks. Stephen, turn it back over to you.